Well, Your Honor, it's certainly a privilege to be here with you, and I want to begin by asking you the question most people want to know the answer to, and that is, how much were the dues when you first joined the Federalist Society?
I knew I picked you for the right reason. What is the Federalist Society?
I don't know.
I don't think there was, I will say this, in 1973 when I became a lawyer, there was not a Federalist Society, nor was there an American Constitution Society. There were lawyers that believed in justice for all, and my belief is that the lawyers, the country, were not as divided on some of the critical issues that we now face, but maybe I'm being naive. But that's a good first question.
Thanks. You fought a battle against breast cancer, chemotherapy, all the treatment that goes with it, and one of the consequences of that is losing your hair. You took the bench on the Supreme Court for oral argument without a wig, totally bald, and that picture went viral around the world. Why'd you do that?
It started with knowing that when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, which was the April before in 2003, my first concern was, just being diagnosed with breast cancer. My next concern was I knew I was becoming Chief Justice in the next year, and I was all about being as strong as I possibly could, and that meant keeping the battle private as much as possible, not missing any time in oral argument, court conference. And as I went through a very extensive journey, of course, as you say, I received chemotherapy and I did lose my hair. And I was determined to have when I started back, because it was over the summer, when I started back with our first oral argument, I was determined to have the very best wig that would look natural. And so there wouldn't be a way that anybody needed to know that I had been battling breast cancer and undergoing chemotherapy. So I had this wonderful wig, and it was Tallahassee in September and October. It was hot here, and in all due deference to anyone that does wear wigs, I became tremendously uncomfortable. In the first oral argument week, I kept it on, but I kept on worrying that my wig was going to not fall off, but become displaced and really look stupid. And so I started to think, why was I wearing a wig? What was I trying to cover up? And over that summer, I had started to go bald, and nobody was concerned about it other than, and you probably know this as a cancer survivor, when people see you with a bald head, they think you're dying as opposed to that you're fighting. And that's what chemotherapy was for me, is making sure that I would continue to have a long life. So I decided that I should not wear my wig on the bench. I asked my colleagues how they felt about my doing it. I think they were a bit awkward about it, but nobody said you shouldn't do it. I had talked to another colleague on the Supreme Court of Canada, and she goes, you got to do what feels comfortable. And that felt comfortable at that time. And so when I went on the bench in the morning, the first oral argument was one in which Arthur England, one of our former justices, was the lawyer. And he didn't miss a beat. And he just started either answering questions or being Arthur England. And I started to forget that I was bald. It didn't feel that I wasn't trying to make a statement. In the afternoon was the induction for the new lawyers, and Miles McGrain was the Florida Bar president, and he made a comment about how powerful a statement it was. Of course, that brought tears to me, and subsequently, it was probably, if I look over my entire 45-year career as both a lawyer and a judge and a justice, and everything in my life, it might have had the most impact on other people, women in particular, that you are not having to hide anything if you are you're not a victim, you're fighting, and it's survivable. And to this day, I'm very glad I did it.
Well, it certainly sent a message to millions of people, whether it was intended or not. The question was, did Judge Azuri know you were going to do that?
Judge Azuri, my husband, Fred Azuri, was so supportive during the time that I had breast cancer. He went to every appointment, and you know how important it is to have spouse support. So I don't know if I specifically asked him what he thought, but I know he was very supportive and very proud of me. And he said in particular that I had a very cute head.
Now, let me shift a little bit.
You didn't think that's funny?
I did think that was funny. How do you think you're going to be defined as a justice on the Supreme Court? The question is not how would you like to be defined, but how do you think you're going to be defined?
That's really hard. You know, if I, as a trial lawyer, I would say that calls for me trying to understand what other people would say. And that's a question that I think is very difficult to answer. So I would like to answer it in the way that I believe that I will be remembered as somebody that for 21 years on the Supreme Court, that I gave this position 100% of my energy, that I cared so much about everything, not just the cases, but issues involving the administration of justice, both in this court and in the court system, and that I was instrumental in advancing the cause of issues involving children and families, unrepresented litigants, and problem-solving courts in the early years. As far as jurisprudence, I may be defined by cases such as the recent series of apportionment cases. I hope
the redistricting.
The redistricting cases, which I authored all of them, and I believe that will go down as being jurisprudence that can be followed. I did it, in my view, in a very intentional and meticulous way. But in the end, I fear that there will be a tendency to say, well, she was a liberal. And it's not that I shy away from being one that cares so much about individual rights, but I don't like being defined by labels, and I've worked very hard, especially since 2012 during merit retention, to explain that labels, being called an activist judge or a liberal judge or a conservative judge or legislating from the bench, does not define who you are. That if you look at the whole body of my jurisprudence, which we've been working on going through files, you will see so many cases where whatever I thought personally, the law required me to follow, whether it was death penalty cases of statutory construction, rules cases. I don't know if that answers your question.
Right. Well, let me ask you first. Do you know if your colleagues keep up with and are sensitive to what's being said about them in the public arena? In other words, if you write an opinion, it's published, it's criticized or praised, are you aware that's going on?
We are aware because we have a public information office, an officer who sends us daily press clippings. The Florida Bar has daily press clippings, so oftentimes the day after there's an oral argument, we read the opinions of the articles that are written about them. So yes, we're very aware, and when it comes to the relationship with the legislature, which has been a 21-year relationship, I like to pride myself on having had, especially during the time I was Chief Justice, very good relationships with many of the legislators.
21 years. Today is the 21st anniversary of what?
Of the 21 years ago today, I was appointed to the Supreme Court.
How did you learn you got appointed?
I learned by being asked to come up here the day before.
Here being Tallahassee.
Here in Tallahassee. I was in West Palm Beach on the 4th District Court of Appeal, and I received a call the day before from the Governor's Counsel, J. Hardin Peterson, who said that they had a few more questions to ask me, and would I please come up? And I was told I needed to be there for the very next day. It's not easy to get from West Palm Beach to Tallahassee, but I got a flight, I packed, and did I have an inkling that it could be about my appointment? I had an inkling, but there were 6 very qualified judges and lawyers, 5 being women and 1 being a male. And it was believed at that time, because Rosemary Barkett had departed a few years before, there were no women on the court, that it was time to put the second woman on. But we had wonderful women such as Martha Warner and Susan Schaefer and Dee Dee Davis from Tallahassee, and I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody. But so I didn't know, and I flew up here. Next day, I go into the general counsel's office. He says a couple of things, and he says, okay, we're going to go and talk to the governor. Still, he didn't say anything. Lawton Childs is there, man of few words, by the way. And he says, or Jay Harden says, let's go, we're going to, into this next area. I don't know still, really, I don't know what's going on. I talked to my husband. He says, well, so what's going on? I said, I don't know. He goes, well, were you appointed? I said, no one said anything. And so I walk a few more steps, and there's the press conference where he announces my appointment. So that's how I learned I was appointed, in front of the press. And
you said, if you're going to do business that way, I'm not going to do it.
I didn't say no.
Okay, now.
And why did he do that? He did it, he wanted to keep it quiet, and since Martha and I were good friends in West Palm Beach, he was worried the word would get out.
So, 4th District Court of Appeal, your husband, Fred Isori,
yes,
served on the 4th District while you're on the Supreme Court.
Correct.
How does that relationship work?
How did it work?
Distance-wise, reviewing 4th District Court of Appeal decisions in the Supreme Court? How do you do that?
Well, first of all, when I was on the 4th District, I had left private practice after 20 years, and I was so happy being on the appellate court. He had a very successful time as a trial lawyer, wonderful, great trial lawyer, and he decided to apply to be a trial judge. So at the very beginning of my being appointed, he was a trial judge in West Palm Beach. That was extremely difficult, because as a trial judge, you're working 5 days a week and 9 to 5, but you're in the courtroom or in your office or in hearings. He became then, shortly after, was appointed to the 4th District Court of Appeal. That became easier in that he had a little more flexibility. He could work on opinions up here. It was, and continues to be, was a very difficult time to be separated from your spouse. It's not easy commuting back and forth from West Palm Beach, Tallahassee, vice versa. We were told at the time in 1997 that justices were expected to live in Tallahassee, not only work here, but live here 24/7. And there's been a sea change, because today, as of last year, the legislature has really encouraged us to have offices in our home districts. Each justice represents a district, and then there are 2 at large, and to provide the travel expenses to go back and forth. But it's never been easy to go back and forth to Tallahassee. It did put a strain on our relationship, but I'm so proud of my husband for being such a support to me all these years, and I'm very excited to be able to, when I retire, within a few, less than 30 days, to be going back and being able to have a day-to-day,
Sure,
in-person relationship.
What about the review of 4th District Court of Appeal decisions when you're on the Supreme Court?
Well, what we decided to do, I actually asked Justice Wells his advice on how to deal with it. He felt it was very important that I not sit on cases in which Judge Azuri was on the panel or the author. And I said, it doesn't matter to me. I disagree with him all the time, so what's disagreeing with him legally to add to it? And he said, but it's not that. It's the perception, that what will litigants think? And so we actually submitted the question to the Rules of Judicial Administration as to, I think it went in there, as to how, if you have a spouse, what should be the rule? And the rule was you recuse. And so it was actually fairly easy that if he was on the case, if I would be recused on the jurisdictional panel, and then if it came up, I would be recused on the actual case, if he was on the panel of the decision under review.
So let's go back to justice living in Tallahassee as opposed to working from home, which I think the legislature recently authorized the compensation if you work at
Correct,
home.
very recently, just last legislative session.
Former Justice Major Harding told me recently that some years back with respect to Massachusetts and New York, that they adopted the same process and it started destroying the collegiality of the court because they were never together. Do you see that coming, or do you see that as a possibility, or do you think it matters?
I think collegiality matters a lot. I have talked to my colleagues that will remain about the importance of ensuring that when they're here for oral argument, that they ensure that they have lunch together, that they create situations where they're all together. But here is what is different from the time that Major Harding and Steve Grimes and those justices who were part of the court of the 80s and 90s, where everybody either was in Tallahassee or moved with their family to Tallahassee, that they may have been in some ways more collegial, but truthfully, we have on this court, even though we have had a court where we didn't have that compensation, that Justice Labarga, after he's now become chief, has gone back to West Palm Beach. Justice Lewis, who was against this idea, travels around the state. Justice Polson is based in Tallahassee. I believe collegiality depends on the personality of those being willing and understanding each other, respecting each other's point of view, and I don't think it matters that you are physically together. However, I will say that having participated in court conferences where we're appearing by phone in different places, that I find court conference much more satisfying when I'm here. I'm a visual person. I'd rather see people's expression and have that interaction. So I would strongly recommend that the court have at least one court conference where they're in person. And of course, we're always together for wonderful events like Pro Bono Day that the Florida Bar sponsors. We're here for the investiture in October. We're here if there are moot courts. And I believe it's important for the court to be very mindful of that.
Okay, so Judge Barkett was the first woman justice appointed, correct?
Correct.
She was gone before you came.
That's correct.
So when you came, you're the only woman on the court, correct? For whatever time it was before Justice Quince came along. Justice Quince is the first African-American woman justice, okay? Now, come January, there aren't going to be any African-Americans on the court. Does that matter?
I believe it matters a lot. We at one time had a court that was representative of the state and of the country. That court consisted of Justice Perry and Justice Quince as two African Americans, Justice Labarga as a Hispanic born in Cuba, myself and Justice Quince as two women, and then Justice Lewis, Justice Kennedy, and Justice Polston as representative of what was Old Florida, if I may say. And I believe that having no diversity, racial diversity, is going back to a time over 40 years ago. I hope the jurisprudence of this court won't go back to that time when there was racism on the court. I'm not saying it exists now, but it is a statement to a significant part of this state that of the 60-plus people that applied for the Supreme Court, that there wasn't one highly qualified African American, and that's not true. There were several. So I think that was a unfortunate situation. I don't know what the diversity is on the Judicial Nominating Commission, but I'm not sure if there's even an African American on the Judicial Nominating Commission. So I do believe that it's going to be a different court, obviously, but it's going to be a far less diverse court. I think we're going to go back in terms of women. There were, when Justice Quince joined the court, there were two of us as women, and we were hoping for, over that next period of time, almost 20 years, that we'd see a third woman. But over all of the different vacancies that occurred, there's only one woman on the list, and that was Judge Jill Freeman, but no other woman was ever appointed. Now, there are only two in the final 11, and I would say that the chances that we'll only have one woman on the court is high, and I believe that's unfortunate.
Okay. Let me go back to what we were talking about earlier, sensitivity to public perception, et cetera. And I'll use as an example, the media they're incapable of reporting on a major federal opinion, district court, for example, and not parenthetically noting which president appointed them, as if this label will explain the opinion. Therefore, if you're appointed by President Obama, you're appointed by President Carter, you name it, over the years, that says it. I don't need to read the opinion. It must be liberal, it must be conservative, et cetera, or it's inconsistent with what you expected. Tell us about your experience in labeling and stereotyping.
I look back on the article from 1999 that's in the Daily Business Review about the change that will take place in the court because of the three new justices, Justice Lewis, Justice Quince, and Justice Pariente. And they predicted that the court would become a different court, which is true. I don't know what label they used, but the idea was that it was going to be, maybe in their view, a more liberal court. I take that to mean that it was going to become a court not only more reflective of the state of Florida, but also a court that would be vigilant in protecting individual rights when those constitutional rights were violated. It's a time I grew up in the 50s and 60s when the courts were there to protect those rights, not to be there to do what the majority dictated, because you wouldn't need a judicial branch. Pete Antonacci, at that time, had a quote. He said, well, we've gotten two branches of government, but we lost the battle because we didn't get the third. Now, I never looked at it that way, but there are those now that are looking at what's going to happen with the new court and labeling that this is going to be a certain kind of court. So I'm very against labeling because I think it reduces to almost something meaningless the decision that a judge or a justice has issued, and the idea that you're labeled either as an Obama judge or a Trump judge, a Democratic judge or a Republican judge, a liberal judge or a conservative judge, an activist judge, which only means that someone disagrees with what the decision has been, gives the public some perception that judicial decision-making is solely about an external factor of who might be the appointing authority. This is, to me, very, very bad for the federal bench. We, of course, as you know, in Florida have merit selection and retention, and we had hoped that we would take the politics out of it. But it's a very dangerous trend, because if you really want to do something to undermine democracy, you're going to do two things. You're going to demean and diminish the judicial branch, and you're going to attack a free and independent media. And I hope in years to come we will continue to have a very vibrant judicial branch.
So let's talk about Florida specifically and labeling. And you've been labeled. We're not kidding each other. You've been labeled liberal, lightning rod, you name it. And you go back to the
What else? Can you give me some others?
There's several.
Things that you don't want to say on camera.
Nice. The rest of them are all nice. 2012 merit retention, labeling you and two of your colleagues. Tell us about it. What you felt going through the attacks you had to bear.
We were the target, we being Justice Lewis, Justice Quince, and myself, in 2012 of a concerted attack when we were up for merit retention. It was, for me, the third merit retention election as a Supreme Court justice and the fourth as a judge, because I had one as an appellate judge. It was the first time that there was an organized attack against us. The attack came from a variety of sources. It came from the Tea Party, the Republican Tea Party. It came initially from the Koch brothers, never sure what they were concerned about in the state court judiciary. And ultimately it came from the Republican Party that attacked us, and they attacked us on labels such as we were soft on crime, using a decision that had been issued in 2004 before our last merit retention election, in which actually Justice Harding had agreed with us and Justice Lewis disagreed, but they put us all together. So we understood that that was a smokescreen for a desire to remove the three of us so that the then governor, who's just about to leave office, could appoint three new justices. Now, I've been accused of saying that this was a partisan play. What I have explained, and this now really shows it, is that I respect the Judicial Nominating Commission process, and I understand that the new justices, now to be appointed by Governor DeSantis, he will have the choice of, within a group of highly qualified applicants, who he wants. But to use merit retention to attack somebody so that you can advance your political agenda is the exact antithesis of what merit retention was to be. And it was a very difficult time. As you know, we were attacked not only through an organized campaign, but we were attacked by being asked to be investigated by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. We had to receive legal representation. We got a very, very fine criminal defense lawyer, Hank Cox. And we also had...
And Bob Josephsberg.
And Bob Josephsberg, who was great, who I've known since 1973 when I was a new lawyer. And it was a very difficult time to...
So let me interrupt you a second.
Okay.
Right? By definition, under Florida's Constitution, the judicial process is supposedly nonpartisan. And yet the Republican Party officially came out in favor of you three justices not being retained. And the governor orders the FDLE to investigate for alleged activity that didn't make sense. Have you changed your position as to whether merit retention is the right way to go? Is there a better process? Maybe we shouldn't be doing it that way.
I do have an opinion that has been formed over the last certainly 6 years, but maybe even before, because I was part of defending Justice Barkett in 1992 when she was targeted. Now, she was targeted, even though they said she was soft on crime, she was targeted because of a decision that respected a woman's right to choose and interpreted Florida's privacy provision. But they used the soft on crime label to target her. But it's very different then, because when we were attacked, we have the rise of social media in a very easy way and sometimes an expensive way. This is what I believe I believe that a merit selection system can be less political, but you have to have a judicial nominating commission that is also non-political. And after 2000, when the legislature, upset about the court's majority opinion in Bush v. Gore cases, changed the composition to have virtually all of the commissioners be either appointed by the governor or be approved by the governor. The system before that was 3 from the governor, 3 from the Florida bar.
And those 6 pick the other 3
and
non-lawyers.
Non-lawyers and really well thought of citizens. It's not that I would say that there is anybody that has been appointed since then that isn't an excellent jurist, but I think this time shows the result of that. And anyone can look back at the composition of this 9-member judicial nominating commission and who they decided to appoint to see that merit selection is not working the way Governor Askew envisioned it. And I had urged people years ago to look at a constitutional amendment that might change it. And I know you on the Constitutional Revision Commission and
Bill Shavino.
And Bill Shavino and Martinez wanted to try to change it, and that didn't occur. The other part is this, is I am convinced that the retention aspect of merit selection and retention doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because we expected it to be used only if a judge was accused of misconduct in office. At least I think that was the purpose. But we have a very strong Judicial Qualifications Commission, as you know, and we have removed judges who have been found guilty of ethical misconduct, mainly or almost all trial judges, but there is that check on it. So I have come to believe that the best system would be one that would appoint in a neutral judicial nominating commission. I've been looking at this along with my staff attorney, Melanie. That would be a truly nonpartisan, apolitical commission that would interview. And then you would have, ideally, a nonpartisan evaluation commission to make sure that the judge was still working diligently, and that I support, as do others, one long term. I would say that 18 or 20 years. Now we're going the other way because now we've got the retirement age of 75, which is going to, and we have some of the nominees who I expect will be appointed are in their 30s. So instead of having a court that will only be a court for, say, a 20 or 20-year period, we're going to have maybe jurists on there for 30 or 40 years. And I can say, as someone that's been the longest serving justice for a long time, before that it was Overton, that 21 years is enough to be able to say, someone else can take my place. The answer is, we thought we were going in the 70s to a much less political system. I believe that merit retention, either the voters don't know why the justices or judges are on the ballot, we expect them to vote yes, but we really don't give them the information, or it can be used as a political tool, and there you are so constrained appropriately by the canons, Code of Judicial Conduct, that you really can't mount a meaningful campaign. You're better off to have an opponent where you can then talk about your record. So I think the retention part is flawed, especially in this day and age.
Now, you have been the recipient of some major recognition for championing the independence of the judiciary. I know you've worked with former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and others. Is that a product in large part of the 2012 experience, or is it your sense of what's happened to the independence of the country?
Both. I could look back again on early speeches that I gave when I first got on this court, and we would talk to, also we have a Justice Teaching Institute where we talk to judges, to teachers, a reporters workshop, talk to reporters about the notion of judicial independence and the idea of our founders and three independent branches that were with checks and balances. So I would talk about that, but in a way, in a vacuum. Then came the decade starting in 2000, where we started with the presidential election and culminating, we had Terry Schiavo, we had many other high-profile cases, and we were attacked. And sometimes there would be legislation that would be proposed, but that also felt like we still had our independence, that we were not looking over our shoulder and feeling compelled or pressured in any way by whatever the legislative opinion would be or public opinion. And I think the 2012 merit retention election just opened my eyes further about the dangers of the potential of a politicized judiciary, and it's accelerated so that starting in 2012, I worked with the National Association of Women Judges on what we call the Informed Voters Project, which produced an Emmy Award-winning film to talk about how this branch is different from the other two branches in that we do not base our decisions on what special interests want, what popular opinion is, what the other branches want. And that's very effective, except that how do you counter that with people that have the ability with a tweet to disparage not just the opinion, but the judges themselves. And so I fear not only within our state, but nationally, that the judicial branch is being undermined, and that is the obligation, every one of us, to try to continue to educate, to speak loud and clear, and I intend to do that after I retire. So I'm very concerned about it.
So the confirmation proceedings for Justice Kavanaugh would do more to set that perception backwards.
I was always able to say, unlike the federal judiciary that have lifetime appointments, we in the state courts have this patchwork of different systems that are very political. I'm very fearful that with both Gorsuch and holding up Merrick Garland's and not having his nomination heard, and then with the appointment of Kavanaugh, that this has become more politicized. Now, here's the difference. Gorsuch has a stellar record, and anybody that would oppose him based on, well, he came out with these decisions. However, with Justice Kavanaugh, just like with Clarence Thomas, there were genuine issues about his background that, in my view, were legitimate to explore. Now, it ended up becoming very much politicized, but I think that that's certainly a basis to look at some. Yes, but I'm very worried about the future.
Sitting as a justice, bar discipline, judicial discipline, death penalty, commercial litigation, children's issues. Is there any category that's tougher to deal with as a justice than the others? Like you said, oh no, not another one of these. This is going to be a problem.
In a way, I'll give you it the other way. Death penalty cases are some of the legally most easy cases to deal with on direct appeal, because we're the first court as an appellate court, so we're deciding evidentiary issues, and we're there to make sure that that defendant got the fairest trial, and if he or she, mostly he, didn't, to reverse that conviction. So we have seen our share of death penalty cases. I say to those that would label me as being soft on crime, it's not a statistic I'm proud of, but of 97 executions that have taken place in this state since the death penalty was reinstated, that I have participated in 57 of them, and only once, or maybe twice, did I dissent, and that wasn't on the basis of the ability of the governor to sign the warrant. One was about what we used to call volunteers, where they had given up their rights, that whether the mother should be able to intervene, and the other had to do with concerns that I had and continue to have on the lethal injection protocol. I would say, and I have talked about this more recently with Justice Quince, that cases that involve termination of parental rights, the child cases, which we don't see a lot of, those are very difficult. And we do our dead level best to expedite those cases when they come to the court, because we know that every month that the child's future is in limbo is a month that is traumatic for them. And so child's time doesn't operate as legal time does, where soon enough if correct, no, it needs to be done expeditiously. But I would say that the most challenging series of cases for me were what we discussed as redistricting cases, because there was a new constitutional amendment and a very short time period for the first one, the 30 days that we had to review the initial plans. We're not set up to do that. I had written, and I look back on how many times I said, I wish the legislature would please look at this and maybe amend like the time frames. I don't know that there's ever been a time that I gave some suggestions that I thought were really good for the administration of justice. So they weren't like, legislature, you ought to fix this. They were really concrete. And so I don't know there was any one case. We always talk about the presidential election cases. Those were the most challenging because the whole world was indeed watching, and we were deciding several different cases in a 36-day period of time where we were literally watched the world over. During that time, we had 2 death warrants that were signed by Governor Bush. We had 2 different weeks of oral argument, and we had there were 2 major cases that we heard oral argument on, but there were a multitude of other cases involving the election that we had to decide. Many of them, or several of them, that if we had decided in a way favorable to Gore, would have changed the result of the election. And so I always take issue with somebody talking about how we tried to throw the election to Gore, and I think that's what the United States Supreme Court felt, because we were a political court. Nothing could be farther than the truth. Those of us that continued in the majority felt that every vote should be counted if you were going to have a fair election, and that you must ensure that in an orderly way. So I think those were the most difficult just because of the time frame. We had to turn around the 2 major decisions in 24 hours.
Mm-hmm. You have championed the delivery of legal services by lawyers to the poor, and you have been a greater champion of protection of children's rights and interests in the state of Florida. What kind of childhood did you have?
I had a childhood that looked like a very ideal childhood, and in many ways it was. I was born in 1948 in New York City. I was the first child in the family. My sister was born 6 years later. My parents were very loving parents, very traditional. My mother, after I was born, did not work. We moved several years later out to New Jersey, to a place called Tenafly, New Jersey, which we learned we had something in common because you were a Tenafly Tiger.
I was a year apart from Justice Pariente in that high school, which we didn't know till 7 years ago.
We didn't know. We never met each other.
Because you wouldn't talk to me when I was in high school.
That is so not true. You were probably a big man on campus or something. I was like a nobody in high school. And in that suburb, it was an all-white suburb. Mm-hmm. It was a middle class to upper middle class suburb. But I found myself, as we went from the 50s into the 60s, as starting to feel the angst of the world around me. And I was, although it was ideal as far as having a 2-parent family and a younger sister, I was very dismissive of my younger sister. It's very much rebellious, not in a way that I was a bad kid, But where I was always challenging, I know that you'd find that surprising, certainly my father's ideas. He was in World War II, and he was, when there was an issue about whether China should be admitted to the United Nations, he was explaining to me why, he had me write a paper called Why Red China Shouldn't Be Admitted to the UN, and I got a very bad grade on that because it was very one-sided. So the 60s became a time of turmoil, and so what defined me, in my view, was not a childhood where there was a family that was broken by divorce. It was very much less divorce at that time. Be divorced as in a two-parent family was seen as a real failure of the marriage, so people stayed together unhappily. Now, my parents were so totally in love, so that was something that in later years, both my sister and I go, wow, they really had a wonderful love story. But
So let me interrupt you. Go back to the championing of children's interests, providing legal services to the poor, independent judiciary. Who are the people who influence that? Where does that come from?
Well, it didn't come from anything that I saw or learned during my years growing up or in high school, because we had no lawyers in the family. My parents had graduated high school when they were 15, my mom and 16 respectively. I look back and I believe that I had a much greater influence because I was born so soon after the Holocaust, was raised as in Jewish religion. My parents were Jewish, and I remember looking at the pictures in Life magazine of the concentration camps and the women who were paraded without clothes on, emaciated, and reading Diary of Anne Frank, and feeling the need to ensure that discrimination like that would never, people say never again, would never occur. I also believe, and whether I knew this at the time, that when now you look at what happened in Nazi Germany, one of the first things that fell apart was the judiciary, an independent judiciary and a legal profession. So that may go back to issues about fairness. But the other issue that you talk about is where I got this passion for those that were unrepresented. I went to college with the idea that I would go into some type of media, either first starting at a little bit public relations, then it was journalism, then it was, I became so interested in broadcasting and film, decided I was going to go into educational broadcasting. Somewhere around my third year of college, I became aware of a program at Harvard. It was Harvard Legal Services. I don't know what the formal name was, but it was right when the Legal Services Corporation had begun. And again, the 60s, as you know, as we know, was a time of change, but there was also a time where there was an acute understanding that for all of us to participate in our democracy, we had to help the least among us. And one way was through ensuring that those voices were heard through the court system. So I did a documentary through school about Harvard Legal Services. I learned about it. I started to think maybe the legal profession would be the way that I could make a difference. I thought about documentaries and how that could make a difference, but I was worried that as a woman that profession would be closed to me. Pretty ironic. I had no idea how closed the legal profession was at that time, or certainly, well, then for sure. So I was influenced in that way by what I learned about what the legal profession could do for those that had no voice.
Okay. So you are white and Jewish. Justice Quince is African American. Judge Barkett is born in Mexico of Syrian parents. Yet you three are inseparable friends. How is that?
How is it? We each have such different backgrounds. We marvel at it. And there's a little something that Justice Quince and I do and we did it for the podcast recently about how different our childhoods were, but we were both born in the same year. We both went to law school in Washington. We both championed legal services for the poor. We both, although I know Justice Quince doesn't really understand, doesn't believe that it's hard to be a Jewish woman as opposed to a black woman, but I have tried to tell her that no, it's not, I can pass as just a person, a woman, but not as be stereotyped, but she can't take her skin off. So I don't try to compare the two, but I believe that I understand what those that didn't have voices, what they went through. And so I think we have a common humanity. We also realize that, again, some of the cultural things, even though we were born, she in Virginia, myself in New York, that we both had, like Davy Crockett was like one of our childhood heroes, or we both loved the same Elvis Presley and Doris Day and Nina Simone. And so we had that in common. So I think that during that time period, even though we were in separate places, we really had more in common than we had different. With Judge Barkett probably could be friends with the world. She has a common humanity. And although her background is different, again, she comes to this country as an immigrant, she had that understanding of what it's like to not have a voice, what it was like for her parents not to be able to come to this country the way that Western Europeans came to this country. Her parents had to come through Mexico, as my husband's mother came, a lot of those from the Middle East. And so I think that we, in many ways, had very different backgrounds, but for Justice Barkett, for Justice Quince, we also had strong family. You just have to meet Justice Barkett's family, her parents who I knew. Justice Quince's father was a strong figure for her and her family. And all our families also valued education, not as a right, but as something that you were to work hard for and do your best. And maybe also as women, we knew we had to always work extra hard to get where we were.
So, assuming for the sake of the question that this nation, this state is about as polarized as it's ever been, at least in my lifetime, maybe yours too. Do you have confidence in the human condition that we'll get through it?
You have to. I am more of an optimist. I started out my life as a very negative person, as a pessimist. I grew up, again, not just growing up, but in the 60s and into the 70s, the Vietnam War was going on and all the protests. And then we had, when I was in law school, we had Richard Nixon as president, and we were angry. We were angry at our country for getting us into the Vietnam War, but we believed in our cause. And I'm optimistic that the best in us is going to always surface. And I believe that young people, you look at Congress now and the new women and men that are coming in, that there will be a difference. And the tide, not necessarily right now in Florida, but the tide in the country is changing because those that are in power are not hearing the voices of the ordinary American, in my view. Those in the judiciary have got to understand why our founders wanted this separate branch of government, and it was to protect, in my view, and I think, and this goes back to Justice Quince and Justice Barkett, and I know for you, individual rights, whether they're defendants' rights, not always popular, but that's what the Constitution was there, to protect the rule of the majority against those who were in the minority, not just a racial or ethnic minority, but those who were not able to have their voices heard in the other two branches. So yes, I'm optimistic, and I hope that we will have a country that maybe has always been polarized. And one thing I must say, we say we're the greatest country in the world, the greatest democracy. My husband likes to say, were we the greatest country when we took the land away from the Native Americans? Were we the greatest country when we authorized by the Constitution the enslavement of those
Asians.
No, in the South.
Oh.
No, that you're going way farther. The Asians during Korematsu were the greatest country when we enacted Jim Crow laws. We haven't had. We were the greatest country when we had aggression around the world. We have the potential. We are the greatest democracy. We have the greatest constitution, but only because we have this structure. And so I think it's important for us to know that saying that we could do better is that's not a slap against those that went before us, but it's believing in the American dream that anyone can come and be wherever they are and rise to be in the positions they are. And certainly that's true if you think of Justice Quince and her rise, or Jim Perry and his rise, George LaBarga and his rise, and Fred Lewis and his rise, because he came from the coal mines of his father in West Virginia. So there is potential, and I hope we will start to come together and not be there just sniping, throwing barbs at one another. We should be very proud in Florida of our judiciary, because by and large, every judge that I know, whoever appointed them, when they get to the bench, and this is why I hate the labeling, most of the cases, we have over 95% of the cases in the state court system, most of those cases don't depend on who appointed you or what your judicial philosophy is. When you're hearing a dissolution of marriage case, or you're hearing a property dispute or commercial litigation, you are there as an arbiter, and so such a small
They're not making the law instead of interpreting.
You're not doing that, yes. And so I guess in conclusion, and I look back at my application that I wrote for the Supreme Court, because I'm going through a lot of my papers, and I'm going to you have it there, I was just going to read if I could. What I said in my application was, I ended with, I've always put 100% of myself into every task that I've been given and every position I've held. If given the opportunity, I promise I'd bring the same diligence, dedication, and enthusiasm to the position of Florida Supreme Court Justice that I have devoted to all aspects of my life. I really believe, as I retire, that you asked, how would people look at me? I really believe that they would all say that I put 100% of myself into every task, and that I had diligence, dedication, and enthusiasm. And the last thing that I would say is I have been so blessed to have my husband, Fred Azzurri, as by my side for this entire journey, even though from a distance, he's been such a support for me. I have 3 wonderful children, and now, just recently, my 11th grandchild, and I am so looking forward to, and that may be a way that I also care about children and families.
And they all need lawyers.
Not only that, but 2 of my children were adopted by my daughter out of foster care, and that so impacts me. Hi there, I'm Justice Barbara Pariente. It's December 10th, 2018, and I am here with 2 very, very dear friends who also happen to be the first and the third women justices on the Supreme Court of Florida. And we thought it would be important for history to discuss together some of our observations with each other, and also our time on the Supreme Court. And I sort of am the bridge, because Justice Barkett and I have known each other since 1975. 43 years, and Justice Quince and I have known each other since 1994, 24 years, and serving together for 20 years on this court. So we're going to start. Justice Quince?
Well, I would like people to understand and know how Justice Barkett actually dealt with being the first woman on the court. When I started, Justice Pariente was already on the court, and so I had that connection already with her, but there were no women when you started, so please tell us about that experience.
You know, it's very hard to think in terms of how I felt at the time, because I don't have a recollection of feeling awkward or different, and I think I've often thought that a lot of that had to do with my background and
Your background as a lawyer or your background as a nun?
I think my background as a nun, because there is this tremendous deference that usually is paid to people wearing a habit, and I think you develop a sort of a comfort level that people are going to be deferential and kind and pleasant to you as they are, and so you sort of expect that. And I think that experience translated into having an internal view that everything was fine. But then on top of that, there was a huge effort, I think, on the members of the court to be very welcoming as the first woman. Justice Boyd, I remember very well, was extremely welcoming. Justice Adkins came into my office and sat down and said, "I want you to realize that you are 1/7 of this court, and the minute you got sworn in, you became 1/7 of the court, and you should not ever think that you're any less than anybody else on this court."
Well, that's a great experience. And Justice Pariente, did you have a similar kind of experience? Because there was no woman. Justice Barkett had already left before you started. So what was your experience
Well,
like?
first of all, I want to say that when Justice Barkett was appointed in 1984,
Yes.
everyone needs to know now and for posterity is that Rosemary talks about her being in a habit as a nun, which people will know was part of her background, who she was. But also, everybody always referred to Rosemary. She was the first woman circuit court judge in Palm Beach County, the first woman chief judge of in Palm Beach County, the first woman on the 4th District Court of Appeal, and then, of course, the first woman on the Supreme Court of Florida. But everyone would always know her as Rosemary. So it is part of who she is that she can both be up there, but also of the people. And what I would say is, having attended your investiture in
1985.
In 1985. It was the first time that I actually was at the Supreme Court, and it was such an uplifting and celebratory time to realize that finally, in this court's 150-year history, there was now going to be a woman. Not that you were going to represent the women of the world, but that the very appearance of having that. So I would say, for me, I followed in Rosemary's footsteps in many ways. We knew each other as practicing lawyers, and the reason that I feel I got my first job in Palm Beach County as a trial lawyer at a firm that had no women was that I was told by the partner that interviewed me, there's a woman across downtown doing a heck of a job as a litigator, and it was Rosemary Barkett. And we have other stories of our friendship and also being on other sides of cases. But once, when she went on the Supreme Court, I was in the process of considering becoming a judge. And I think back now, probably it influenced me, because she really has been a mentor my whole legal life. It's true. And that she did such a spectacular job on for her short stint on the 4th District and then her longer short stint on the Supreme Court of Florida. My home, as you know, and husband was in West Palm Beach. And there was this feeling at the time that I was being interviewed and then appointed that you had to live full-time in Tallahassee. And so I was very aware of that. But I had the fortune of having also wonderful colleagues. And I knew Justice Anstead because we were colleagues on the 4th District. And also Justice Kogan, I knew, and Justice Overton. They were, I would say to a man, that they also were welcoming.
Yes. And I knew Peggy, too, because Peggy appeared.
I actually appeared before Rosemary.
Yes.
It's still hard to say that to me.
Come on.
Even after all these years. I appeared before her, and she was quite the questioner when it came to cases that I had before the court. And when I started at the Supreme Court, of course, I already knew Barbara. We had met each other when we were both District Court of Appeal judges.
Oh, that's right.
Gone walking in the mornings at conferences together. So I knew her already, so I felt very comfortable with her. And the men, I must say, really were welcoming. Although Justice Pariente, of course, I moved here without any place. I hadn't come up here and found any place to live. And so Justice Pariente actually offered me a place at her house, and I stayed there for a couple of weeks before I found my own place. So the court was really welcoming, and of course Justice Shaw was here, who was the second black justice on the Florida Supreme Court, and so yes, he was the second after Justice Hatchett, and so I really felt pretty comfortable here. But it was quite a leap from the District Court of Appeal even.
But I would ask you, because this is what people always seem to ask, is you came up and felt welcomed,
I did.
but you brought a unique perspective to this court. Whether you think it's because you were a woman, a nun, an immigrant coming from Mexico, born in Mexico of Syrian parents, or because of your entire life experience, what perspective with your background, which includes your gender, do you feel that you brought to the Supreme Court?
I really think it's, if I were to choose one overarching attitude, for want of a better word, that was kind of perhaps new to the court. It was one of comfortableness, of flippancy, if you will. I was more comfortable and wanted everybody in Florida to be comfortable with the Supreme Court. And I think I made, well, it wasn't really an effort, because I was the first woman. That phrase just sounds so strange, but because I was...
Okay, you were the first nun.
That too. I would get invited to many, many of the Women Lawyers Association meetings, very many other things where normally they wouldn't have felt comfortable asking one of the justices of the Supreme Court. And so I would go to everything and everywhere.
I think that's really true, because I was a government lawyer. Right. Prior to being appointed to this court. And, not a lot of government lawyers actually end up on the District Courts of Appeal, the Florida Supreme Court. And so I think it made a lot of lawyers who were not the big firm lawyers feel a lot more comfortable and connected to the court. And I know exactly what you're talking about, because everyone needs to realize that the Supreme Court is for everyone.
That's right.
Did you ever see yourself looking at a case differently because of anything that you would attribute to your background?
No, I would never see a case differently, but I think that I brought an experience to the discussion that is different, things that people would not think about ordinarily.
I really have an example that has always stuck with me, that I think, really being a black person, I I viewed it differently. And that is, we had a case involving a young man who was in what is known as a high crime area, and he saw the police and started running. And that gave them a reason to stop him. If he had not been running in what is considered a high crime area, they would not have been able to do that. And so to me, it made no difference that this young black man was running in that neighborhood versus another neighborhood, and
You were able to bring that perspective.
But the United States Supreme Court had given the police the right to do that. But I still felt that it was just not.
And that was really something that I know you were frustrated by, that our Fourth Amendment was amended to supposedly be just what the U.S. Supreme Court said. So it was called a conformity amendment. And that meant that we couldn't decide a case differently.
Based on our own Constitution.
Based on our own Constitution. But I have one other example and then I know you, that I think, for me, in a conference was startling. It had to do with whether Florida's ban on open carry was constitutional. And in the discussion, one of the justices who grew up in the Panhandle said, well, here everybody's got guns in their pickup trucks and they're out. And Justice Quince said, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, yes, but guns, open carry, were used to intimidate blacks. And that to me reflected this, what you said about experience, this markedly different experience growing up and understanding that open carry is well, first of all, everything about our gun laws are different from the rest of the world, but that at least for open carry, that there were reasons not to allow open carry.
Assumptions are made that something exists or doesn't exist, and the importance of diversity is that, and when I say diversity, I am not talking about diversity of gender or diversity of race. I'm talking about diversity of experience and viewpoint, because there can be women or blacks appointed to a court who have exactly the same views as perhaps everybody else on the court. So it's important, in my judgment, to have diversity of viewpoint, diversity of experience. So the example that I was trying to think of, it's a little example, but nonetheless, the case involved a person who had a lot of cash in their home, and the assumption was made by one of the justices, well, he wouldn't have a lot of cash in his house if he wasn't a drug dealer or something of that kind. And I said, what are you talking about? My father did not believe in banks, and he had a lot of cash in his house, which we were always looking for. we never
What
did.
happened in your house? The bank doesn't give you any interest
anymore. That's right. But they said, what? I said, yes. I said, I know a lot of people that have a lot of cash in their homes, and they're very upstanding citizens. But it wasn't within the context of their experience in their lives. And so I do think diversity of experience is hugely
also,
important.
I have to say that we're not going to talk about Bush v. Gore or all those cases, but in the end, the decision came down to was 4-3. And the three were Justice Harding, Justice Wells, and Justice Shaw. And the four were myself, Justice Quince, Justice Lewis, and Justice Anstead. And in looking at how we might have seen the issue regarding what we saw as fairness to make sure all votes were counted, we look back and realized that none of our parents went to college. Now, in fact, some didn't even graduate high school. And whether that formed experiences that were different than Justice Shaw, whose parents went to college and were teachers, Justice Wells, who had lawyers in his family going back, and Justice Harding had college educated. I don't know. But it's, as you keep on, as we say, your life experience does form a basis, whether now someone might say it's an implicit bias, but how you see the world, and then how you see the world may influence how you see a particular case.
I'm sure, and I know that it does for me for voting. I don't care if the only thing on the ballot is who's going to be the dog catcher. I am going to vote because I know how hard it has been for women and for blacks to get the vote. And so why squander it? If you want to be a part of this country, if you want to be what I believe is a good citizen.
Any cases that you feel that you were involved in while you were on the court that either were, momentous for you or that you think about even now?
All of the cases that I worked on were momentous at the time in the sense that they engaged your heart and your soul and your intellect to try to, bring to bear whatever you could to try to find the right solution to the problem that was being posed. So I'm sure there are a lot of cases I can think of that you could name, but I don't see it that way. I think every single case that I worked on was meaningful.
You're absolutely right. I think that every case that comes to the Florida Supreme Court is a very important case for the people of the state. Whether it's just a conflict case between one district court of appeal and another, it's very important that we resolve that conflict so that all the people of the state are treated the same no matter what part of the state they're in. And so every case, really, whether it's a bar case, if a lawyer or a judge needs to be disciplined and told that they are not acting in a manner that they should be, it's important.
That's right. I don't think you decide a case based on who appointed you or a particular attitude about gender or race or whatever. I don't think you do that. No, I think every experience I've ever had with other justices anywhere has been one of, on this court, has been one of great integrity in the sense that they have tried to apply the law as they saw it. But having said that, I do think that your view of government does impact the way you look at a particular case, especially a constitutional case. I used to teach a little bit about there are ways of approaching a case where you begin by looking at individual rights and the Constitution as protecting individual rights as the primary beginning point of your analysis, and then you determine whether or not government has or has not a legitimate reason or a sufficiently legitimate reason to affect the curtailment of that particular individual right. So that's one way of looking at it. That's the way I have a tendency to look at things. There's another way of looking at a case from another person's point of view who will say we should start with government has the right to do whatever it wants to because it is the majority, and therefore if you begin with that premise, you may come out with a different attitude. So how you view government in this country and the intent of the framers of the Constitution, the perception that it has to be a living Constitution might dictate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it also goes to your perception of the role of the court itself in our scheme of government, and whether the court, I view it as the court is there to actually protect individual liberties. It really was a relief to have another woman available to talk to. I mean, I could talk to the men, but there's some things you don't want to talk to men about. And so it was nice having a woman around.
And but I have to say it depends on the individual woman, not any and every woman would have been.
You're absolutely correct. You don't always, just because it's a woman, doesn't necessarily you're going to be a friend.
And I hate when I hear about women who are partners in law firms and don't do everything they can to bring along other women. Right, and that is something important. Thank you for indulging me to have this conversation today with both of you to maybe give some insight into who we are and what our experiences have been together and individually.
All right.
Very lucky people, the three of us, in every way, both professionally and personally with the three of us. It's very unusual, I think.
And I know we will be together even more in the future.
One of the things that we didn't cover earlier in our conversation that I wanted to be sure to say is how gratifying it was that of all the people that were going to replace me, that it was you. And for so many reasons, Barbara. We had been friends for so long. You remember, there weren't very many trial lawyers in West Palm Beach. There was Edna Caruso and myself.
And I don't know if she was an appellate lawyer, Marjorie Gadarian.
But she came a little bit after Edna, I think, yes. And then there were more. You came and we tried to start, you remember we tried to start a women lawyers group, but it was a very informal one.
It was the predecessor to the Florida Association for Women Lawyers Palm Beach County chapter. And of course you had hosted a reception, a dinner at your house, but there were so few of us that we could go to dinner and be at a round table for 8 or 10. So
Right.
it was that small. But I want to emphasize that I credit you with my getting a job as a litigator with the Cohn Wagner firm. Had not had any women, and it was there hearing what a great job you were doing, and actually Edna also as
An appellate lawyer.
and she did a little trial work, and so I think you won every case that you tried.
No, I didn't actually.
But it felt like that. Because I think the same thing, you had no fear. You were comfortable with yourself, and that was evident. You became a trial judge, and then quickly were elevated, and then...
Well, before that, there was a disagreement among our original partners at Farish and Farish. And Joe felt very strongly that we weren't entitled to anything upon leaving the firm. The rest of us felt we were, and there was in contention a verdict that the firm had obtained against MacArthur, if
John
I'm
G.
not
MacArthur.
mistaken. So it was a significant amount of money, and we needed representation. And at first, we went to talk, of course, to your firm, and we talked to Chuck Nugent, who was one of the senior partners at the time. And then he thankfully appointed Barbara to be the point person on the.
Now, what I remember is you went to me to say, I'm going to be, if you don't come into this case.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And then I left with Lou Silber in 1983, and we took the case with us. And what I'll say about having Rosemary was bad enough having her as a lawyer to litigate against, but having her as a client was one of the most stressful times in my legal career. Yes, it was.
It was
so
not.
I had three of them: Ken Slinkman, who's still a lawyer, Hugh Lindsay, who became a judge, and Rosemary went from the time I started becoming a circuit judge, then an appellate judge, and finally on the Supreme Court.
That's how long the case lasted.
So when we were
Either that or
preparing,
that's how short the ascension occurred.
we prepared, and the way we'd prepare is Rosemary would come and she'd have a chart to explain how I was to organize the trial preparation. And Ken Slinkman would be there giving me all these details, and fortunately Hugh Lindsay would just
Show up and say whatever you want to do.
So we get to
The actual trial.
The actual trial, and everyone in Palm Beach County had to recuse themselves. So we have this judge, Lamar Warren, who was a senior judge. Joe Farish, who was on the other side, brings in this Harvey Duval, whose name will be remembered by the Historical Society. He ran against Leander Shaw, I think, for...
No.
Who?
He
Joe
ran
Hatchett?
against Joe Hatchett, I believe.
Well, we're not going to talk about him, but let's just say that they thought he had an in with Lamar Warren. So we're very concerned about that. So three things stick out in my mind about what became a very successful result. One is that I was very worried that Lamar Warren would favor Joe Farish. We felt much better that on the day of trial, he asked Rosemary to come up because he wanted her autograph, because he had gotten autographs of all these Supreme Court justices. So that felt good. The second thing, and let's just put it this way. Joe Farish was arguing that Rosemary and Ken and Hugh Lindsey were not partners. Well, I had his tax returns that he filed as partnership tax returns. So really, when I think about it in retrospect, I don't know what else I had to do other than show that. But of course, being me and representing such important people and friends, I felt I had to do as much as possible. So the second thing that happened is now I was a trial lawyer. Before I became an appellate judge, I did not do appeals work. So there would be questions that Joe Farish or, Harvey Duval would ask. And there's Rosemary sitting in back of me, and she's punching me in the back, and she's going, object, object. And I'm going, this is a bench trial, and if I keep on getting up and objecting, it's going to be very disconcerting to this judge. But I did what I could, but it was, again, the days were wearing on.
You did what you could. You kept slapping me away. Sit down, be quiet.
All right, midway through this trial, and this is the last memory before the good news, the judge had a yellow legal pad. And as some of the questioning is going on, this is for all you trial lawyers out there, he took the yellow pad and he put it in front of his face so we couldn't see his expression. My thought was that was the end of the case. What we realized later is he had decided in our favor early on, and the rest of it was just irritating him. And I
don't remember that.
Yeah, well, I remember that. And it was a short time after he actually called the office, my office, which was then Pariente and Silber, and asked me to write up the final judgment. So did that go on appeal then too?
I think it did.
Yeah, but anyway, in the end, it was very successful. We always say that case, which was Farish against MacArthur, fed many, many lawyers and clients, so it was a great result.
It was very fun.
So those were our two experiences.
And then thereafter, then you and Fred Hazuri decided to get married, and it was great when I was asked to officiate at the ceremony, and that was wonderful.
I think you've been part of every important event in my life from the time that I met you, but you're going to be coming to my 70th birthday party on December 24th, and I'm so glad I'll be able to see you then. I have been very, very fortunate because you don't do the job that I've done, or any of the justices, without a great staff. I've always believed in rotating my staff attorneys so that I have maybe one career staff attorney, but having young people coming out of law school that come in. And I have been so fortunate. I couldn't have done anything I did these last 25 years without having what I consider to be the best judicial staff in the state of Florida, maybe ever.
Hi, I'm Melanie Kalmanson. I currently clerk for Justice Pariente, and my term will end when she retires in January 2019. And I'm here with others who have also clerked for Justice Pariente, and I will let them introduce themselves.
So I'm Jay Yagoda. I clerked for Justice Pariente from 2010 to 2012.
I'm Tanika Jones. I clerked for Justice Pariente from 2004 to 2006 during her term as Chief Justice.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Lathrop. I clerked for Justice Pariente from 2009 to 2013.
Hi, I'm Lily Van Whittle. I clerked for Justice Pariente from 2009 until 2016. And I'm Kristen Bond, and I currently clerk for Justice Pariente, and I will also be with her through the end of her term.
Hi, I'm Matthew Chris. I clerked for Justice Pariente from 2015 to 2017.
Hi, I'm Andrew Manko, and I clerked for Justice Pariente from 2006 to 2008.
I'm Josh Gardner. I clerked from 2000 to 2002.
I'm Joe Eagleton, and I clerked for Justice Pariente from 2012 through 2015.
So I just have some general questions about what it was like to work for Justice Pariente. First, if you could describe BJP in one word.
Brilliant.
Perfect.
Passionate. Supportive.
Mentor.
Caring.
Role model.
I was going to call her an Energizer Bunny.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll allow two.
Thank you for that.
I would say fearless.
Brilliant.
Tenacious.
What made you apply to clerk for Justice Pariente?
For me, it was kind of an easy decision because I'd already been at the court, and I just saw how much of a family her staff was, and I was so excited to have a chance to work for her. So when the justice that I was clerking for retired, it just worked out perfect that she had an opening.
And I had actually externed for Justice Pariente and gotten to know her a little bit, and I was just amazed by her. And so when an opening came up, it was perfect.
I was interning at the court at the time for a different justice, and the opportunity came along for me to apply for a clerkship, and so I jumped at the opportunity, applied, and was thrilled when I got a chance to be selected as one of her staff attorneys. So it was just a wonderful experience, and I've always admired her as a person and as a justice, so it was a dream come true, to be honest.
I have the same answer as Alyssa. I had externed at the court during the summer, and the opportunity arose to apply, and I had an amazing experience, and I knew it was something that I wanted to do, and fortunately, it worked out.
My story is similar to Tanika's. I had always looked up to Justice Pariente as a role model, not only in the courts, but her work for children and families who are affected by the law. And so I heard a colleague in law school tell me that she had just posted a position. To this day, I feel terrible about it, but when he told me that he had applied and it was open, I sprinted home and applied immediately, and I never apologized to him, but that's okay. I was chosen fairly.
Now he knows.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm sure he knows by now anyway, but it was my dream job, and I was so fortunate, as everybody says.
And I clerked for a judge at the 4th DCA before I worked for her, and he's very good friends with her, and so when he knew she had an opportunity, I had always also looked up to her, and so the opportunity arose, and here I am. And I was actually her last staff attorney she hired, so that's...
And I was also an extern, and Lily was part of supervising me during my externship, so we're all kind of interrelated, which is great.
So for me, I knew I was going to be moving to Tallahassee from DC because my wife was starting graduate school. And I didn't really know what I was going to do after graduation. Was I going to hang out a shingle and be a solo practitioner? That didn't really seem like something that made a lot of sense. Justice Pariente and I graduated from the same law school, and my wife was actually the one who suggested, well, hey, why don't you apply at the Florida Supreme Court? And so that's how I became interested, and that's how I applied.
I actually interned for her my first summer of law school, which is how Josh and I overlapped for a brief period of time. And I am from West Palm, and so kind of knew mutual people, and I applied. I was in law school out of state, so the formal law clerk program, I wasn't really eligible to be part of that, and so I submitted an application, and she accepted it. And I know that I came in this realm where everyone was a Florida student, and I felt immediately like a fish out of water a little bit. And that's one thing I'll remember from that, was she was so generous with me in terms of making me feel like I deserved to be here and comfortable in that way. And then when I ultimately graduated law school, I moved to New York and had a job up there, and I didn't think about coming back until I got to a firm in New York and was like, this is horrible. And so I applied and came back, and that's why I ended up coming back to Tallahassee.
I met Justice Pariente at a law school event. She lectured a class that I was in, and she was supposed to lecture on a particular, constitutional topic, and went way off topic and started talking about the importance of an independent judiciary, which is very, very important to her. And I asked her if she would be willing to come back and speak to a broader audience at the law school. And I thought, for an organization I ran, and I thought that just meant she would be a speaker. She'll show up in a few weeks. But then it turned into, well, no, I'm going to come and speak. Why don't we, ask the Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court? Why don't we, get justices from all over the state, from all over the country? And it just turned into a huge symposium. So I started working with her throughout the whole year of my 2L year. And then she even asked me to help her put together potential applicants to apply for a clerkship in her office, other UF students that she may look at. And I gave her a list of names and even,
Were
picked
you
out.
included?
No, because I wasn't even on my radar. And then after the summer associate position, after that term ended, I realized I really, I liked the firm. It just wasn't for me. And I knew that she had a position. I asked, could I apply? And the rest is history. I'm like the Dick Cheney of, law clerk selection.
I think my story is maybe the most boring of all. I think just her reputation preceded her a little bit. And so I took Florida constitutional law at UF with the former dean there, John Mills, and he couldn't say enough good things about her. And I was interested in clerking and had talked to a few professors about it, and they just sort of encouraged me to apply broadly, and it turned out that she was looking at that time, and so she was the right fit for me then.
How would you describe working for Justice Pariente?
Growth mindset. You're constantly improving.
I would say worth it, and I say that because sometimes it can be daunting.
You do question that sometimes.
And overwhelming. But then, you work on something with her and you see the final product, and it's all worth it.
I would say it's good preparation for what the practice of law is actually like. I know, during my experience, it was hard work, but also enjoyable, and she created a great atmosphere for her law clerks. And as Lily said, you felt very supported in everything you were doing. But at the same time, after I left and started my first real attorney job, I felt fully prepared to handle anything.
To this day, I think it was the most challenging job I've had in my career, in part because the work we do here is just by nature challenging. And what I found from her, no matter how hard I worked, she expected us to work hard, as you should here. I always knew she was going to work as hard or harder than we did. I would leave if it was late at night. She was there later than I was. If we ever had to come in on the weekend, she was there on the weekend when we had to come in. And that always, made me feel, it made me feel like we were doing important work, but I knew that she was in it as much, if not more, than we all were. She always made it a very team effort, which I appreciated. She was also super generous. Previous discussions you all talked about in difficult times, having dinner brought in. Whenever we had to be there on the weekend, she always made sure that we had lunch or we had dinner. So there was a generosity there that I really appreciated.
I think it's really good that by design it's a 2-year clerkship, because the first year, you just graduate from law school, you really know nothing about anything, and then on top of that, trying to acclimate to the rhythms of an appellate clerkship is a challenge. And then by that second year, at least I really felt like I had an understanding of what to do, and I was much more efficient, and it was a much easier go than that first half of the clerkship. She is very tenacious, as I think Matt said. She is up at all hours of the night. She's always emailing. Now, this is before, galaxies and the like. So I remember that feeling of dread coming in every morning to see how many emails I got. I also remember And it has stayed with me to this day, and I still do this to this day. I remember once early on in the clerkship, my desk was particularly messy. There was just stuff everywhere, and she chastised me for it. And to this day, if you were to walk in my office right now, you would see a completely clean desk, because it has just been ingrained upon me that you should not have a messy desk.
Yeah, I had a similar story to that. There was one point where I just had things in piles because there was so much going on. And she came in, I think she looked at me and she said, "Are you okay?" She's very worried. There's so much stuff in this. I was like, that's a sign that I need to get this cleaned up. But I mean, I think working for her, I mean, these guys have touched on it, just incredibly rewarding. Obviously, the cases here are interesting and important, but I have certainly friends who clerk for other justices, and they had different experiences. But from my perspective, there's nothing like clerking for Justice Pariente. She's just she's brilliant. She is just detail oriented. She wants to make sure every single word of her opinions is right, and that really made an impact on me, and I think rubbed off on the staff, and has stuck with me now in my career.
How did working for Justice Pariente prepare you for practicing law and going into your next job? Even if you're not practicing like Lily, I know you're doing something a little different.
And for me, it worked out really well. I both do appellate, in terms of it's so in some ways it's very similar to what I was doing for Justice Pariente, where I work on appellate and I'm kind of a staff attorney for the commission at the Public Employees Relations Commission, but I'm also conducting hearings and making determinations and writing orders. Where I'm deciding in terms of recommended orders, where I'm deciding and giving them my findings of fact. So having a chance where, like for me, where I had a chance to kind of see, and you're reading transcripts, all of these detailed transcripts of trial judges, a lot of times I channel that experience, I channel what I've seen, I've channeled her advice in terms of what do I do in terms of in that position. So yeah, so for me it worked out, and it made me a much better writer, which makes me a much better writer for what I'm doing now.
And I have to agree with that. The writer I was when I started working for her, I was just such a better writer when I left. And she just gave me such great feedback and such great support. And her feedback in those discussions were always extremely productive and informative. And so when I left the court and I went and worked for a state agency before I'm actually working with Lily at the Public Employees Relations Commission now, I actually just walked in and felt prepared to handle anything.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. It's excellent preparation. I mean, she always let us know that she was supportive of us, but she expected the absolute best from us every single day. Mm-hmm. We had to come forward and be prepared to put forth our best work. Mm-hmm. But because we each had a hand in the final written product, it was good because you were constantly improving, you were constantly finding ways to be better. And so that helped tremendously going out into private practice, because you weren't so tied to your work that you resisted the opportunity to be better. Mm-hmm. And she taught us that. I mean, she really instilled a sense of excellence in each of us. So I think it was excellent preparation.
She really had a way of helping you think through all aspects of one issue.
Yes.
And it's very helpful in practice to approach work the same way. You don't always have the same amount of time to think through the issues the way you did at the court, when the expectation is to get it absolutely correct all the time. But there really was something very special about that relationship and working through issues.
Yeah, she really makes you see the case holistically.
Yes.
Right.
And even when you think you do and you give it to her, she comes back with a question.
Right.
Yes.
And you say to yourself, how did I miss that? Or how did I not think of that?
Absolutely.
Let me go spend another 2 hours trying to figure out what else I've missed.
Or 2 days.
Or 2 weeks.
So when I prepare for any oral argument, my philosophy is, what do I want the court to hold? And if I can figure that out, I can answer literally any question that any court asks me. And that was something I actually got from the justice, where when she would go through her questions and things like that, trying to understand, like, where's she coming from with her questions, it's to develop that holding, right? And so it's a very specific thing that I took from the clerkship, but it's something that to this day I still use, and it's been very effective, and it's really because of the way she asks questions in oral argument.
The clerkship experience, by the end of it, you realize how to really spot the actual issue. Maybe your opposing party has framed the issue one way, but she trains you in a way that by the end of those 2 or 3 years, I don't have to accept that, and I want to lead the court in another direction.
Yeah, I joke sometimes that I work less in private practice than I did working for Justice Pariente. So I think she instills sort of the hard work that you need for practicing law, and also just the idea of thinking about cases from the court's perspective and trying to figure out, what is it that the court would be concerned about here. I think a lot of times in litigation, the parties are often fighting with each other a lot, and sometimes lose sight of what it is that the judge or the appellate court might be interested in or care about, or how their opinion would ultimately look. And sometimes if you can pitch the case in that way, you can be more effective.
And I think too, a few things to go back to what you said, the question we were just talking about. One of the most valuable lessons I learned, other than being organized and being prepared and all of that, is she sat down, I can't remember when it was, at one point, and we had a conversation about, being happy in your career and your job. May have even been after I left, but she said, don't look 2 steps ahead. Live in the moment, focus in on what you're doing, because you may love what you're doing, but if you're constantly thinking about, well, wait a minute, I want to get to here, I want to go there, you may miss out on the job that is your dream job because you were too busy thinking about something else. And I've always tried to remember that in every job I've had since then. Maybe there'll be periods where I'm not happy or I'm thinking about whatever else, and I would just hear her in the back of my mind telling me that, just, focus in on what you're doing.
Did working for Justice Pariente open new doors for you? And I'll speak to this because before I applied for my clerkship, I was also looking into jobs post-law school, and I really only had a few choices, but I know now, looking at my job search after my clerkship, it was just such a different experience. I could talk so much more. I was so much more educated about the job search process and really what I wanted to get and what skills I would bring to the table that I know. And of course, her reputation, right? I mean, you can go anywhere and say her name and everybody's like, oh, Justice Pariente clerk, I need, to hire you. It absolutely opened amazing doors for my future. Does anybody else think that?
For me, one of the reasons why, in terms of the job that I'm at now, happened to in terms of where that opportunity came for me, is because one of the people that's a hearing officer there now was a clerk here at the Florida Supreme Court, not for Justice Pariente, for Justice Anstad, but he knew the philosophy of both working for Justice Pariente and he knew, in terms of when he saw that I was clerking for Justice Pariente, what that meant. As well as the fact that he knew, too, in terms of the experience that we have here, that you could do that balance where it's both, trying to find someone that's really good both in terms of being able to see things on a trial level and an appellate level. It's hard to find that experience in a lot of people. So I think it made me incredibly competitive for the job, and it worked out really well.
And I would just have to agree with that, because one of the people, when I went in to interview for my current job, he had clerked at the court. He knew what working for Justice Pariente entailed, and he knew that I could absolutely think through all aspects of a case and see things from both sides, which I think really kind of gave me a leg up.
Sometimes that's the worst part about, when you leave and go into private practice, because you learn a skill set here about viewing cases from both sides. And, there are times in practice where I sit there and I'm like, oh, goodness, I know the other side has a better argument. But you make your argument anyway. But also, part of the experience here is because of the different types of cases that you work on, it sort of helps you figure out maybe what you want to do and maybe what you don't want to do. Mm-hmm. So in addition to working for Justice Pariente specifically, but also broadly, it helps you sort of narrow your focus.
And I know it really did help me because I went back home to Miami to practice after I left the court. And so she has built up a tremendous reputation all over Florida, but particularly West Palm Beach, and then also in South Florida. She's very, very well known. So having that on my resume, having her as someone who people knew that I worked under, learned under very early in my career, because it was my first job out of law school, was just a great, door opener for me. And everybody wanted to know, how was it working at the court? Because we worked on such amazing issues and just so many different things. So, I think people already assumed before they even met me that, oh, she's got to be wonderful because Justice Pariente chose her to be part of her team. So, yes, definitely a help.
What was your most unexpected assignment, if you remember? I'll say mine is, we're working on an article right now. Someone asked her to write it, I believe, at the end of August, and the final draft, that should be 30 to 40 pages, needs to be turned in December 1st. And we're doing it. We are going for it. But I would have never thought that at the very end, on top of everything that we have to do, I'd be writing that article.
I can give you mine. So maybe other people knew this before the clerkship, but I did not, that we were responsible for giving basically tours to groups that come to the Florida Supreme Court, like a docent or something. That was something I had not expected, frankly. I came to like it after a while. The first few times took a little bit of getting used to.
That just jogged my memory. I remember one day I was so thankful I actually got dressed nicely one morning, because she was running late or something, and Brenda comes into my office and she said, Justice Pariente wants you to go down and talk to a group really quickly before she gets down there. And I was like, okay, I was not prepared this morning for that, but went over fine, and she came in and everything went well. But I was very thankful I pulled out a good outfit that morning.
The one, I can't think of a work-related one, but there, when she was out of town, she probably knew sometimes we would dress maybe a little more casually, and she was supposed to be gone one day, and she called unexpectedly to ask if I would give her a ride to the airport, and I was dressed very casually, and I came down, 'cause she would drive, in the back, and I got in the car, and she took one look at me. She didn't say anything. And then we just went, and that was it. It was like, she didn't say anything. I was like, oh my God. So, not work related, but.
And I'll say that was one of the really funny things, because I am not the strongest driver in the world. And so when you would take her to the airport or pick her up, and she'd ask you to do it in her car, I would constantly say, no, I can take you in my car. And she would insist, no, let's do my car. And it was just that white knuckle grip. I was terrified. And she'd always have these shortcuts that you would just. Terrifying, absolutely terrifying.
Mine would be working on a law review article with her, editing the article. I wasn't a co-author, but it started before I even began my clerkship, and it just morphed into from a 10-page article to like an 80-page article, and that went on for a while.
I guess I would say mine is for the last reunion that we had done, we made her a bobblehead that was a Justice Pariente bobblehead. So it had her face on it, looked like her. And when Justice Labarga was coming in to become Chief Justice, she came into my office and she said, we need to get him a bobblehead. So my assignment was to get a good picture. You had to put in different side views of their face so that they can create the bobblehead to look accurate. And so we had to really dig deep to make this bobblehead of Justice Labarga.
What's your go-to story about your clerkship?
Well, my go-to story is, and it's an example of what a tremendous person she is. I had a leak in my apartment, and I walked home one day and literally water was above my ankle. And I came to work the next day, mentioned that I had a leak, had these huge industrial fans everywhere, and the judge goes, well, you can't stay in those conditions. And I said, oh, it's okay, Judge, don't worry about it. She said, no, absolutely not. You're going to go home, pack your bags, and you're going to stay with me.
Oh, that's
And she opened her home for me. And I'll never forget that, because she made me feel so welcomed. And I was stressed because I had work, and everybody here knows the demands of working at the court. But she literally opened her doors for me and made me feel so welcome. So that just was a testament of what a great person she was inside and out. So thank you.
One of my go-to stories is just how brilliant and amazing her memory is. As an example of it, is she would come in and say, "I wrote a concurrence in a case 8 years ago. So and so wrote the majority. It was about this."
I just can't remember the case name.
And I said X, Y, and Z. Go find it. And sure enough, she wrote a concurrence 8 years ago. That justice, and she said X, Y, and Z. And I just don't know how she remembers all that, but she's just amazing.
And that will happen, and you'll bring her a case and think, "Oh, I got it." She'll say, "Nope, wasn't that. Go look again." And then, sure enough, there's one even more on point. It's amazing how you're totally right.
I think for me, one of my go-to stories is really just Justice Pariente and I used to work out downstairs together. But she has this whole holistic view of us as people. We're not just people who work together. She does a great job of creating a team of all of her people together, but then she sees each of us so individually. And her drive, how she does everything, how she balances everything. So here it is, even though you might have a lot of work and you're trying to get this and that, but she's also like, but it's also important to take time for things like exercising and that sort of stuff. So we would go downstairs after a day of work and use that. And sometimes we're talking about, work, and sometimes we're talking, just on a personal level. And I think that that's just one of my really favorite memories.
So mine would probably be, and this isn't one specific story, it happens multiple times every time she's here, so I have the office that is second away from her office. So there's her office, there's another staff attorney's office, there's my office. And so all of our doors... Yes. So all of our doors will be open. Yeah. And she will get on speakerphone.
That's my favorite memory.
Yes. And she will call the staff attorney next to me and won't say, "Hey, come here."
And they share a wall.
We share a wall, which the walls here are very thin. So all of our doors are open. She's having a conversation with a staff attorney next to me while she's on speakerphone. And I'm supposed to be like making quick edits to something, and I'm just like, I can't do this. So, but and also for anyone who hasn't met Justice Pariente, she's a little loud. So it's just, but it never fails. It's multiple times when she's here, and it's funny because no matter how stressed I am about what I'm working on, I always laugh a little bit when it happens.
It's also that secondary panic when you hear speakerphone, the dial tone.
Yes.
You hear pound.
I had that office.
You
office.
You hear a button. You hear another button, and then you wait. Is it me?
Okay.
Is it me? Is it me?
I was like, oh, good. It's Lily.
Yes.
But mine's a variation of her story because it wasn't when she was calling another staff. I have the same office. It's when she called me on the speakerphone. But I was right next to her office, and I'm like, "Judge, I can just go into the office at this point."
No, that's not necessary.
Or she could just yell. You'd hear her saying.
It was the same. It was echo. I heard it twice.
My go-to story is just that no matter how hard you're working, you're not feeling like you're doing it for nothing or you're just giving someone work product. She is working just as hard as you are. And I think that's one thing that I appreciate about her.
It is nice. Whenever we work late hours, she's working late hours.
Oh, yes.
And sometimes working more. I mean, I'm exhausted and she's going home and it's like, oh, yes, she's going home. And she's like, well, I'm taking this with me to read. It's like, wow, I am incompetent.
Yeah. She always had something to take home.
Exactly. I would be there at 11 o'clock at night, and I always tell people, I'm like, but she's there at 11 o'clock at night too. So she never expected anything of us that she wasn't also doing. But of course, at 11 o'clock at night, I'm dragging in, I'm like, okay, Judge. And she's like, all right, well, let's discuss X, Y, and Z. And then she would go home and I would get emails from her later that night about a case, which is absolutely amazing.
Or you'd give her work product on one case and she'd be like, so what's going on with this case? And you're like, but Judge, I just spent 2 days on this. It's not possible.
That's another, whenever she leaves and just drops a pile of things on your desk. It's amazing.
How has Justice Pariente affected your life even after your clerkship?
Other than the clean desk?
Yes. But I feel like she served as a mentor for you and that the relationship is lasting. It's not just a clerkship.
No, for sure. The discipline, the hard work, the putting in the hours, the being willing to work as hard as the people that work under you, as an example, all of those things I think I can attribute directly to the justice.
I think in any, whether it's a professional crossroad or just any, really day to day, if you ever have an issue, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, what would BJP say? Because she's going to be right.
I have and now let me think, how many jobs have I had since I graduated law school? 1, 2, 3, I guess I'm on my 5th. Every time I was thinking about changing jobs, she's the first person I call. And she always is willing to talk to me for as long as I want to talk about it. She will talk it through. I mean, she has been my most valuable mentor in my career.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And also just even beyond a professional level, I think she's just a really good person. And so the what would BJP mantra, what would she do, works outside of the office too. Yeah.
Her relationship with Judge Hazuri really was a model relationship for my wife and I. We got married right before the clerkship, and we saw them interact all the time. We'd go to dinner with both of them, and to this day, we still remark about, the love between them, the mutual respect for each other, and it's something that really has carried on with both of us.
Matt, I think you can comment on that too.
Yeah, they are a model couple, and you'd always see them up here in Tallahassee when Judge Hazuri was here. It was kind of funny because he would show up and say, "Okay, it's time to go. Like, we're going to dinner now. Come on." But they're a model couple.
And they worked together, and so they know very well each other's strengths and weaknesses, especially when it comes to the law. So.
And about what Josh just said too, the sense of humor. I think a lot of people who don't know her, she comes, she's a very strong, smart judge, lawyer and then judge, and I think she can seem very serious to someone who doesn't know her. And if you see the two of them together, I mean, Judge Hazuri he's a funny, sarcastic person. And she has a really good sense of humor. And I think the first time I saw them together, I felt like a little more comfortable to joke with her a little bit more. And I'm a sarcastic person, and I had no fear, I think, with her. And I enjoyed our relationship for that reason.
And I'm not sure anybody can get her to do anything faster than he can, because if somebody calls, it is not important unless it's Judge Hazuri. She will be running down the hallway like she cannot miss his call, which I think is great, because she knows he needs an answer when he needs one. Any other last thoughts, stories?
It's an honor to work for her. I mean, the experience by itself, clerking at this court, is obviously an honor. But working for her, learning from her, benefiting from her mentorship, her friendship, it's an honor. And it during that time. You realize that you're privileged to be here and to be learning from her, but I don't think it hits you until after you've kind of, reached the summit and you look back and say, wow, I learned a lot.
It's funny, I always wish I could go back and do the clerkship now with the experience and maturity I have, because I think it would be a very different experience than right out of law school. But I agree with everything that was just said.
Yeah, I think I'll never look at the Florida Supreme Court the same when she's gone. For me, it's sort of synonymous with her, and I think, there have been many great justices and legal minds who've come through here, but, I think she'll really be missed, and she's at the top of the list, I think.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for coming and sharing your experiences. We are here with Justice Pariente's staff attorneys who worked with her during the Bush v. Gore cases, and I will let them introduce themselves.
I'm Josh Gardner, and I clerked from 2000 to 2002.
And I'm Jody Wilkoff, and I clerked from 1999 to 2002.
Perfect. So can you explain the atmosphere at the court during that time?
Sure. It was chaotic, to be sure. I can tell you outside of the court, it was fascinating because there were all these tents and cameras, and I remember vividly seeing Jesse Jackson, with the Push Coalition, giving speeches, a guy dressed like Jesus carrying a gigantic cross on wheels, walking around the courthouse, state troopers everywhere, reporters as far as the eye could see, and it was wild. And then I think inside the courthouse as well, it was a little chaotic. Obviously, there was a lot of activity in terms of short deadlines and the like.
Looking back, what was it like to be at the court at that time that was so significant in American history?
I think in many respects, it was a little surreal, where we were learning about many of the events from the same sources as the general public, which was the internet and television, because so many things were happening in real time. Sometimes we were almost the last to learn about them. Inside the court, obviously the work was accelerated, but it didn't really feel like anything different than any of our other types of cases. It was the same deliberative process, the writing of majorities and dissents, but just everything happened on a sort of a quicker time frame. I think for me, one of the most surreal parts about it was you expect that at least some of the decisions the court issues while you're clerking will go up on appeal, ultimately to the Supreme Court, maybe they'll resolve them, but you never expect that to happen while you're clerking,
Right.
let alone twice in the same case. And I must say it's a little surreal is probably the best word I can use to see you get reversed twice by the Supreme Court while you're clerking. That was unusual.
There was a lot more collaboration among the offices because we were so time pressured to get things
Right.
out that we were working with maybe people we hadn't worked so closely with before.
Right, that makes sense.
I think that's right.
When the case was first filed, did you realize how important it would be? I've had the great pleasure of going through a lot of the files. There were so many cases that were filed, and even before the election was over, and the results became an issue. Did you realize when that first case was filed how important it would become?
Do you want to go first?
I don't think that I did. That was an interesting election because Justice Pariente as well as Justice Quince and Justice Lewis were on the ballot for merit retention. And we had been somewhat focused on that.
Right.
Not so much as law clerks, but just in our own time kind of figuring out what that was going to look like. And so we were really focused on that. And I remember Justice Pariente was in my office that night. We waited for her results to come in. We saw that they were great. And I wasn't thinking much, honestly, I wasn't thinking much past her election. And so when that came about, I remember I had plans to go away that weekend and went away and really wasn't thinking about what that next week was going to be like, so I didn't.
Yeah, no, I went for Thanksgiving in Fort Myers, and I remember we got the phone call, and we headed back immediately, and I think by the time we headed back is when we realized, at least I realized, that this was going to be, this was going to take some time.
Right.
And this wasn't going to resolve itself quickly. It felt like every day there were these new developments that kept these cases going longer than I think, frankly, I expected them to go. I certainly didn't expect it to go into December.
Right.
So speaking of you going away, just reminded me that this all happened over Thanksgiving, right?
Correct.
Did it affect your holiday?
Well, yeah, like as I was saying, I went down to Fort Myers for Thanksgiving, and then I got the phone call, and then I immediately drove back to Tallahassee. So yeah,
same for me.
I think it was Friday morning, I think, if I recall correctly.
So kind of on that note of it upsetting your normal balance, what was the latest you remember being at the court during Bush v. Gore?
So, Jody and I were talking, we had at least one all-nighter, if not two, for sure. And I can tell you a funny anecdote about that. I used to bring my lunch every day, and obviously I didn't expect to pull an all-nighter when we did. I didn't have a lunch. It was too chaotic to go out to grab something. My wife at the time she's still my wife, but at the time she was in graduate school in Florida State. We'll edit that.
Thank you for clarifying.
And I had asked her if on the way to her school, if she could drop off my lunch. She's like, sure, no problem whatsoever. And so she comes to those big front doors, the metal ones.
Not realizing the circus that was the court at the time.
You could certainly see the chaos, but you sort of assume that you can get through the front doors, and as soon as she gets to the front doors, the media just descends upon her, and I swear it was like law clerk gets lunch at noon. And I think part of the reason for that is every time those doors would open, Craig Waters would come out with some sort of an announcement. So perhaps they thought that my wife had something interesting to tell Craig. I don't know, but that is sort of I think it mirrors the chaos as well as sort of the craziness of the hours to get to your question.
So going with the circus that was outside the court, kind of after that all passed, I believe they made a movie about this, right? Have you two watched it?
Sure, yeah.
And do you think it was accurate?
So from my perspective, the large focus of that movie is on the political maneuverings between the Bush and the Gore campaigns, and obviously I have no insight into that. My recollection is there's at least one courtroom scene from the Florida Supreme Court. It seemed fairly short in duration, and from my recollection, it seemed relatively accurate. I can tell you this, shortly after the election, there were a number of books that came out. Jeffrey Toobin had a book, there were other books that came out, and I found that those books were not entirely accurate in a variety of different ways. But in terms of the movie recount, the small slice that related to our jobs, I didn't find anything inaccurate about it, and it certainly was a big kick getting to see the justice portrayed by an actress.
Any input on who should have played the justices?
Yeah, Sandra Bullock.
Did either of you ever see the ballots?
Yes, yeah, we both did actually. I remember we were in a relatively darkened room with tons and tons of boxes with the butterfly ballots, and we got to look at them, and I'm not really quite sure to this day what the purpose was of looking through them, but it was sort of neat. I mean, in many respects, the handling of the election case was like any other case, meaning like with the death penalty cases, you go through the entire record, you see the photos, you see the transcripts, and this was in many respects no different, where we were looking at the physical evidence that had been presented, and that was the butterfly ballot.
Any other stories you have from that time?
I mean, I definitely remember, and this is apropos of nothing, that Justice Pariente and Justice Quince went to go see Charlie's Angels during the election. And
a good mental break.
I don't know why that has stayed with me to this day. I couldn't tell you who wrote what decision when or who took the pen and what, but I vividly remember Charlie's Angels.
I just remember feeling, and I'm prone to being nervous anyways, but just feeling a little nervous about security, and particularly her security. I mean, this was pre 9/11. So there were different security measures, and I don't know if you remember one night, it was early on, I believe it was agents of the FDLA came and escorted her out.
Wow.
And
it's a little harrowing.
That made me fearful for her. I worried about that a lot.
Yeah. And you just sort of wondered when it was going to end.
Right.
Because you kept feeling like there was this end, and then some other development would happen and would keep getting extended. And so as you were getting closer and closer to January 20th, there was, I remember, this legitimate concern like, what if it goes past January 20th? And you're like, it can't go past January 20th. And then you're like, but what if it does? And I remember having that feeling that like, it just would not end. And of course, you have to remember, that wasn't the only case on the docket.
I was just thinking that.
I mean, there were still death penalty cases. There were still,
On that note, wasn't there a warrant in and around this time?
The governor signed 2 warrants.
And those, of course, are so much work.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. So it wasn't as if we got to state everything else we did and not review cert petitions and all that stuff. I mean, all of that normal work kept going on, and then on top of that, this. But back to Jody's point, I thought that was a really great example of all the clerks collaborating together in a way that we typically wouldn't do on normal cases, because we did sort of have to divide and conquer in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And I know for me, I worked with justices that I'd never worked with before, worked closely with them, that I never did before or after.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I can't imagine what it was like to be here at that time.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Her clerks who worked for her during redistricting, and I will let them introduce themselves and then explain what redistricting is or what the cases were about.
I'm Matthew Christ. I clerked for Justice Pariente during the Apportionment 8 opinion.
I'm Lily Van Whittle. I clerked for Justice Pariente during all of the redistricting opinions.
I'm Melissa Lathrop. I clerked for Justice Pariente during the first 2 rounds of redistricting.
I'm Joe Eagleton, and I clerked for Justice Pariente starting after the first 2 opinions through almost the end.
I'm Jay Yagoda, and I clerked for Justice Pariente during the first 2 rounds of redistricting.
And to give a brief introduction to what redistricting is, the Fair Districts Amendments, Amendments 5 and 6, were passed, and they drastically changed the standards that applied to apportionment. And so the 2 rounds I was there for was all about, well, what are these standards and how do these standards apply, and are these districts constitutional?
Thank you. So my first question is, what was the atmosphere at the court during that time?
There was a lot of excitement. During the rounds I was there for, some trepidation, because the first round we would only have the case for 30 days, and it was a lot for just 30 days. And everybody had, not just our chambers, other chambers had these huge maps up on their wall that were filed. And so you were sitting there looking at these huge maps on your wall, waiting for the petition to get filed, just knowing it was going to be kind of a crazy, hectic time.
Yeah. Lots of caffeine is what I remember the Starbucks runs. Thanks, Alyssa.
We all got our gold cards very quickly, yes.
There was a lot of work that we were doing before the case ever arrived here that I don't think all of the other chambers were doing. Because it was just so intensive too, though, you know, all of our focus was pretty much just on that one case, because it was the first 2 were just such incredibly short time frames. And it was, you know, to review all of the different districts.
And also just learning the technology. There were different apportionment programs. The House had one, the Senate had one, there was a couple other ones. I went to law school because numbers are not my thing, but there was just a lot of numbers, learning the programs, learning what the percentages meant. So it was just very unique.
Prior to this amendment coming through, because the timeframes were so short, as you can tell from prior opinions, the court just really couldn't get us in depth into the challenges that they had after the amendment was passed. So it was fascinating and exciting being able to work on a case where you're both trying to decide what these new standards meant, what these new words meant, and then you actually had the opportunity to really get in depth. You know, before, a lot of the opinions would just say, you know, it was a very narrow issue, and those narrow issues completely opened up, and this was the very first time that was.
I think a part of the legwork before we actually had the petitions was, you know, like they said, we spent several months researching the issues about how the standards would be defined. Mm-hmm. But it was in a vacuum. We had no idea what the challenges would be. And then when we got the petitions, half of it was figuring out how what we had researched would apply to the, you know, and the attorneys who briefed the issues were highly sophisticated. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, unlike a lot of the briefs we had received before that time, I don't know if you felt the same way, at least during part of the rounds. And so it was exciting as a law clerk to see some of this sophisticated briefing, but at the same time, it made me very nervous because, you know, you didn't want to get anything wrong, and it was important. The issues were very important for the state of Florida.
And after the first round, the opinion, Justice Pariente's opinion, ended up being 200 pages long. Yes. And we only had the case for 30 days. Right. So that should give you an idea of how much we slept.
And it wasn't 200 pages long for lack of editing. There was a lot of different information in there.
So going back to Alyssa's comment about lack of sleep, what's the latest you remember working during this time? And I know Brenda tells the story about driving a FedEx package to the airport because you missed all of the other FedEx deadlines. So I'm sure it was late.
Well, the FedEx run was not an unusual run for me.
That was early. Because that's 9 o'clock. Yeah. I still remember that. It was early. Yeah.
Well, I have 2 stories about that. One,
I know one of them.
One, I had not seen my husband for a few days. Because I would come home after he'd gone to sleep and get up and come back to the court before he got up. And one night I was so tired and I needed to just throw my clothes in the wash, and we had a front-loading washing machine. And he woke up at 3 a.m. and apparently I was so tired I'd put my clothes in the wash and I just sat down and was watching and he came, I was just totally just exhausted, and he came out and he's like, go to bed. What are you doing? I'm like, laundry? He's like, go to bed. And then the latest was, I know one day I left here, went home, showered, changed, and came back.
Yeah. Wow. I was actually kind of tracking my hours as to how many hours I was working during that time, and it was over 100 hours a week for a couple of the weeks.
For 3 weeks.
And for 3 weeks, yes. And so, and all of us were pretty much putting in the same thing. One of my favorite stories, and it kind of is, we had given her a proposed summary that they could circulate to the other justices as to what we were thinking. And I think it was around like 2 o'clock in the morning. We were all still there, and suddenly on my email screen, I started hearing ding, ding, and that was Justice Pariente at home sending us emails because she was reading it, and she had. And I don't remember how many dings happened. I think I twitched with you.
I still get like a twitch when I hear dinging, even on my Outlook now. I'm like, oh no, it's back. But like we would get the emails where the body of the message was blank, but the subject was a paragraph.
With a paragraph.
So,
Yes.
So you have to scroll through that little window to figure out what you're researching
Exactly.
next. Yes. Did Justice Pariente do anything to help you relax during that time?
One of the things, she was incredibly supportive. We didn't even have time to get food, so she would actually send Brenda off to go bring us food to make sure that we actually
And Starbucks.
And then she also brought in her masseuse one time, which was, I didn't realize how tense I was until her masseuse came, and all of us were just like waiting,
I'm like, her 30 minutes is up. We got this opinion.
I was very jealous when I heard about the masseuse on Porchman 8.
You missed that.
Well, Lily was there too for Porchman 8, and she, tell us a story about the masseuse. I'm like, what?
So were the turnaround times during the subsequent cases 30 days? Also?
No, so you guys laid all the groundwork, and we had it easy, I think, after that. And so, up until really apportionment 7, the cases that came after the first round of redistricting were during the ongoing litigation. And so I think there was some time sensitivity. There was a writ petition sprinkled in there. There was a discovery issue, I think. And so there was some, time deadlines given the ongoing trial proceedings there, but it was nothing like that first round. I think that just meant that we got to keep working on those cases in addition to all of our other cases.
I'm trying to think back to that time period and whether I really appreciated before it started how much time it would take to get the opinion out within 30 days. And when it came, it was in 2012, and I was in my second year of my clerkship, and they had been working for Justice Pariente for
It was my third year.
3 years and 3 or 4 years. So she had a team of attorneys who were already working with each other for a while, and we all knew each other's strengths. We all knew what who to go to for specific questions, but I don't think any of us quite grasped what it would be like to go through those 30 days and put it all together.
I had an inkling because I'd been at the court during the last redistricting, and so and I knew that even in that, even though the chambers that I was working there wasn't the chambers that actually had it, how much time I went through, both learning the software and going through and trying to decide, trying to assist the justice that I was working for with the issues that were before him. And I was, the more I got into in terms of this also is involving the standards, I got really nervous. That and the way that when she first talked about this case, she actually, it felt to me like she really understood it exactly. And I was like, oh, she's really giving us a really, there was almost a trepidation in terms of how many hours I think that I kind of got a feeling from her. And I was like, if she's experiencing this, and I've never seen her, with that kind of, I was like, it must be pretty. Yeah. So I think she probably grasped it much more so than I did, even with that. I was probably not anticipating, though, in terms of how many weeks of 100-hour,
and the oral argument, it was just like entertainment. I mean, it was such a spectacle, right? When the oral argument happened, and they brought in attorneys from D.C. and they did the oral arguments, and it was.
Was there a lot of media outside? What was it like?
Yeah, I remember there being. I remember the court being full.
Yes, the courtroom was full.
I didn't remember. I still don't remember much of what was going on outside of the court, but it was probably because of sleep deprivation. to be fair.
Anything else you all remember about redistricting or funny stories?
I have a funny story. I think it also illuminates Justice Pariente's personality and how much she prepares for these cases. But the day before the apportionment 8 oral argument, she had a previous commitment at the University of Florida Levin College of Law to lecture Florida constitutional law class, and she was going to lecture. She was going to do it. And so, but she still needed to prepare for OA. And so she asked me to drive her to Gainesville, and the whole drive was just questions, like just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
So you had to really be prepared for that drive.
I have a similar story. It didn't deal with redistricting, but I had a similar experiences, where she pulled out my bench memo for the OA while I was driving her to South Florida and started redlining it and asking me questions about it. I'm like, Judge, I'm driving you. It's funny.
I think that my funniest memory that I remember, one of the things that I didn't anticipate in terms of with redistricting, when you have a regular caseload plus you have redistricting on top of it, and it was so intense during that period, we weren't really able to work on the other cases in addition to this. Everything was just this. So once it was finished, once the opinion was out, we had a bit of a backlog in terms of catching up. And so she called us all into the office, and she was very thankful about everything that we had done. And she's like, well, I hate to say this, but when you look at the list, we do have a lot of stuff. She goes, but you guys have worked so hard, and I really appreciate. We couldn't, I can't imagine in terms of a better team to go through this. And the team that she's had for redistricting through all of it has been just amazing. But then she was like, so I want to give you guys a day off, so why don't we take this next Friday off? And Alyssa and Jay and I were looking at each other because it was actually a holiday, and we're like. And so Jay was the one brave enough to actually say, he's like, well, Judge, that's actually a holiday because the court's closed. And so we were all thinking she should say the day before. And she goes, oh, well, then you guys should definitely take that day off. And we all just laughed.
I guess I would just say, I think, not being through the first round, but then seeing it almost to completion, I think each of the opinions along the way really sort of built on the other. I think we were always really conscious of, what was the purpose of these amendments. But, personally, I was always a little jealous that I never got to have any of the maps out for a lot of these cases that they were involved in at the beginning. And so towards the end of my time with Justice Pariente, when apportionment 7 came back around and the trial had finally finished and there were challenges again to the actual districts, we broke the maps back out, and I decided to put them all over my office. And then just been having, I remember, I think when Matt started, he came in, the first thing he saw was these maps just all around the office, and he wasn't sure what he was getting himself into.
I was looking around, and I was going to inherit Joe's office, and he said, "This is your future."
I haven't looked at a map since.
Good thing for Siri. Huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you all for coming and talking about your experiences. I'm sure it was, now looking back, a great time to be involved.